I'm sorry to disappoint you, I don't have any PowerPoint with me today. Usually I don't read papers, but today I will, because I think that the subject that I've chosen is kind of difficult. And I picked the subject before I had any idea what to say about it. Because responsibility is something that interests me and should interest us all. So in this brief talk, I will address two different ways to understand responsibility from my point of view. One is what I call judicial responsibility, and the other is moral responsibility. To establish responsibility in the first sense, that is judicial responsibility, is a matter of empiricism. And to establish responsibility in the latter sense is a moral and ultimately a spiritual question. To be responsible is to respond to a calling from an environment that I consider mine. That is, constituted by others that I consider significant. Therefore, I have moral obligations towards them. But it also means that I am significant to them. I am embedded in a social and moral network. This network of significant others may consist of my family, my tribe or nation, my contemporaries, all human beings living or not yet born, or all beings living, unborn, or dead. The expanse and the inclusiveness of my moral universe defines the limits of my responsibility. Nothing and nobody included in it is morally indifferent to me. Responsibility may sound like a burden because it demands something of us. But being responsible also means to identify with the world and be a part of it. A sense of responsibility is a sure sign of being at home in the world. And whereas a lack of this sense of responsibility, that is indifference, is a very sure sign of alienation, of being homeless and a stranger to the world. So the more responsibility we feel, the more inclusive is our moral universe, and therefore our home. A responsibility is therefore also always constituted in relation to scale, social scale, temporal scale, and spatial scale. And it's understood very differently depending on what scale we consider. It may be my responsibility to keep my family together and to give us common memories from an unforgettable summer. Therefore, I book our tickets to a two-week vacation to Thailand. We return home suntanned and knit more closely together by the wonderful memories that we now share. I have taken my responsibility towards those significant others I call my family. But have I taken my responsibility towards the underpaid staff at the hotel that hosted us? Have I taken my responsibility towards future generations and other species when all of us individually in the family have emitted approximately 2.2 tons of carbon dioxide to create memories to strengthen our family ties? So considering different social, spatial, and temporal scales will give us very different answers about our morality and about our responsibility. Moral and spiritual growth is about expanding our moral universe and therefore our circles, widening our circles of responsibility and empathy. This growth is partly a question of individual will, but much more importantly, I think, about the spiritual and moral training provided by the cultural traditions in which the individual is embedded. A culture without spiritual training will, I believe, inevitably cripple us all, morally and spiritually. But all individuals cannot be asked to bear the same responsibility, since it is always a matter of power, which in turn is a matter of the individual's or group's scope and reach on different scales. The more power we have, the greater our reach and on different scale, and therefore our responsibility. As Spider-Man's uncle reminds us, with great powers comes great responsibility. Now, ideally then, power is matched by morality. The more power we have, the sort of a more stronger moral system we also need to have. The global system in which we are all embedded depends for its very existence and reproduction on technologies with consequences that we seem to be both unwilling and unable to control and take responsibility for. Artificial intelligence, nuclear power, and an ever-increasing consumption of fossil fuels. Therefore, technology now has a wider reach than politics. Or as political scientist Leonidas Donskis puts it, technology has outran politics. The more complex and interconnected the world becomes, the more difficult it is to discern the relationship between actions and their consequences. The longer the distance and the more steps that are involved in any chain of actions and consequences, the more difficult it becomes to determine responsibility. If the chain of events is long enough and has a countless number of links, the question of responsibility, that is the relationship between an action and its consequences, becomes obscured. One of the primary roles of the social and political sciences and of the humanities and of spiritual leaders is, in my view, is to continuously clarify and expose these links of interconnectedness in a complex world. That is the main task for intellectuals, I would say. The question, who is responsible, may seem to be an empirical one. And the answer may be the one whose intentions and actions have caused the specific, often undesirable effect. So once we have established the chain of events leading from an action to its consequence, we have also established who is responsible. Now, in parentheses, I want to say that I don't have the time to address the complex question of free will at this point. So what I have said so far could roughly be described as a judicial view on responsibility, of identifying the agent behind an event or a series of events that have led up to a certain consequence. For example, was Donald J. Trump responsible for the terrific events on January 6th? That is a question of responsibility, so backtracking through the different chains of events. Was he the cause, or was he one of the main causes behind these events? But there is also another and radically different way to establish responsibility that has nothing to do with cause and effect, but only by morals. From this perspective, responsibility has nothing to do with either causality or justice. My moral obligations are not dependent on your ability to fulfill yours. They cannot be delegated or shuffled off, nor are my moral obligations in any way related to my previous actions. Responsibility cannot be assigned, only accepted. Do I accept responsibility for the suffering of other life forms, irrespective of my own previous acts and thoughts? That is the question we have to pose ourselves. Once, Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said to a friend, "I'm not a religious person, but I can't help but see every problem from a religious point of view." For Wittgenstein, it seems that a religious approach to problems means that they are mine, not somebody else's, and that the answers to these problems consists not in changing circumstances or in some kind of intellectual insight, but in my transformation, in my becoming another human being. One of the first computer games I ever played was a racing game. It must have been in the mid-1990s or so. In my field of view on the computer screen, I had in the foreground the steering wheel and the dashboard. Through the windshield, I saw the racetrack disappear into a haze. The starting field was lined with flags and what I interpreted as an enthusiastic crowd. My co-competitors were grouped around me at the starting line. They were certainly, of course, just an accumulation of pixels, pre-programmed to respond to my actions. But I imagined that they were as filled with tense anticipation as I was myself, waiting for the start signal. And there it came. I pushed the fictitious gas pedal to the bottom, the tires howled, and the roadway rushed towards me at a breathtaking pace. I rounded a curve and a new view presented itself. We left the street network behind us and came out on winding roads surrounded by mountains and forests. After each crest, a new landscape appeared. But the view was not static. It wasn't there waiting to be discovered. It emerged and it changed continuously, pixel by pixel, in relation to the exact position where I was. The philosophical tradition known as phenomenology always sees the subject in this way, as occupying a specific position and embedded in a social, cultural, and geographical landscape. The self appears in relation to the world and therefore cannot be understood as an isolate. But the world itself also appears and emerges in relation to a perceptive subject. If the subject moves just a little, the world, pixel by pixel, will find a new form. World and man create and reproduce each other in a reciprocal and ongoing process. A tree accepts its place and its time and conserves the resources at its disposal. Patiently it grows without regretting or complaining about the place that became its fate. In a similar way, argues Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, the place of man, and I quote, is unique, irreplaceable, and inaccessible to the other. In this way, we are, in a moral, if not in a geographical sense, like trees, obliged or privileged to live in the very time and very spot and very place that is ours. Mikhail Bakhtin's formulation of moral obligations does not anchor them in abstract or generalizable principles. Instead, each norm takes on its meaning in relation to a unique and non-interchangeable place in existence, your place. I occupy a place that is irreplaceable and inaccessible to all others. Where I am now, no one else is. What I can do can never be done by anybody else. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, we encounter two radically different approaches to suffering and responsibility, embodied by the two brothers Ivan and Alyosha. There's a third brother as well, but I want to talk about these two guys. The rational Ivan cannot deal with the meaninglessness of the suffering of innocence. And since he is both unable to ascribe meaning to suffering, that is to control it intellectually, and to close his eyes to its reality, he has but one option, that is to flee into madness. He becomes mad. Craziness is his only way out. Alyosha, the younger brother, chooses a different path. While recognizing his inability to understand and control the world, he is still obliged to actively take responsibility for it. This commitment is the very essence, maybe even the definition of faith. Alyosha acts as if the other person's tragic situation were always his responsibility. When Alyosha encounters a suffering human or animal, he does not, like his intellectual brother Ivan, ask the question, why? Nor does he ask if it is possible to change circumstances. Instead, he wonders what he himself should do as a response to the other's vulnerability. For Alyosha, the world is his responsibility. To be morally responsible for the world is, to put it another way, to be responsible for God. Etty Hillesum, a Dutch Jewish woman and author of confessional letters and diaries, describing both her religious awakening and the persecutions of Jewish people, was murdered by the Nazis in 1943. Through her remarkable diaries and letters, we meet an original and passionate religious thinker. For Etty Hillesum, God was dependent on man, and it was the moral duty of humanity to help God and take responsibility for God. Everyone, all of us, are called upon to prepare within ourselves a space where God can dwell, so that the spirit of love will survive in and through the horrors created by man. Being responsible for God means being responsible for the survival of whatever is good and precious in creation. This responsibility is always mine. It is a heavy burden, but also a source of joy and belonging. an acknowledgement of my being a part of the world rather than a visitor in it. Non-interchangeability and uniqueness are signs, maybe even the definition of sanctity. That which is irreplaceable is sacred. Therefore, the acknowledgement of our unique responsibility, yours and mine, is also an acknowledgement of our sanctity, of the image of God within each one of us. Judicial responsibility may thus be established by connecting, either directly or indirectly, a specific consequence to the actions of an agent that may be an individual, a group, or an institution. And it is basically an empirical question. Moral responsibility, however, is ultimately universal. It encompasses all of us, but can only be interpreted individually. By acknowledging it, we place ourselves in the world, not as spectators or visitors, but as participants. And the moral questions that Christians must put to themselves is therefore not, what would Jesus have done, but what should I do? Thank you.